Welcome, friends.
Hello, everybody. All right, I will be kicking things off here. I think I'm highlighted. I hope so.
Yes,
Um,
and we could see you, we can hear you. You're doing good.
Love it. Hi, my name's Jordan Brinker, everybody. I'm the web marketing manager at the Bradbury Center. I'm here to lay down some house rules. Well, you guys can't really talk because we're in a webinar, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop those into the Q&A section. And if while we're working, if you decide to share some of your writing, please feel free to put that in the chat section. And with that, I will hand you guys off to Dr. Jason Ackerman, the Bradbury Center Director.
Thank you, Jordan. I want to welcome all of you to the Bradbury Center's first virtual writing workshop. As Jordan mentioned, my name is Jason Ackerman, and it's my great honor to be the director of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies. We're going to be broadcasting the workshop this evening from our very own recreation of Ray Bradbury's home office, reconstructed with entirely original artifacts on the campus of Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. The Bradbury Center was founded in 2007 by my predecessors, Chancellor's Professor Dr. Jonathan Eller and the late Dr. William Tupons. The original mission of the center was to promote scholarly work on Ray Bradbury. And through our work in the center, we established the first critical edition of Ray Bradbury's earliest works via the collected stories of Ray Bradbury. And we also produced a scholarly journal, the New Ray Bradbury Review. The Bradbury Center's mission expanded significantly in the fall of 2013, a little more than a year after Ray Bradbury's passing, when the Bradbury family and Ray Bradbury's close personal friend, Don Albright, gifted a massive collection of Bradbury's papers, correspondence, and other writings, as well as the late author's working library, office furniture, typewriters, and numerous awards and mementos that Bradbury received during his professional writing career, which spanned 7 decades. Literally overnight, the Bradbury Center evolved from being a robust research center into a museum, archive, and public outreach center with a collection valued at nearly $7.8 million. One of the things that Ray Bradbury is best known for is his firm belief that literacy is a precious gift. It's our best technology. By reading, we're able to think the thoughts of some of the most interesting people in history. That great minds continue to live long after death in the writings they leave behind for the generations that follow. Today, the Bradbury Center preserves and advances this aspect of Bradbury's legacy by providing programs like this for the public, helping people find ways to advance their literacy, to become better readers, better writers, and better thinkers. People often think, I can read, I can write, I am literate. And while this is true to a point, that statement, I am literate, can be incredibly misleading because there is a finality implied. Mission accomplished, victory won, I'm literate, I don't need to keep working at it. When it comes to literacy, nothing could be further from the truth. Just as woodworkers, stonemasons, artists, and many others spend decades, even lifetimes developing their craft, people can and should view their literacy in the same way, continually practicing it, getting better, and finding ways to advance it. The benefits are astounding. Better communication skills, increased empathy, creative intelligence, intellectual agility, skills in encountering difficulty and engaging the unknown. We cultivate our humanity by developing our literacy, and that's ultimately what tonight is about. So on that note, it's my great honor to introduce a good friend of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, TJ Martinson. TJ is a writer and literary critic from right here in Indianapolis, Indiana. He's currently finishing his PhD in English at Indiana University, Bloomington. His dissertation, Genealogies of the Postmodern, Reflexive Embodiment in the Genomic Age, investigates contemporary metafiction's unique capacity to reflect and generate models of 21st century embodiment following the Human Genome Project. If that sounds intimidating, you're in good company. I do as well. Don't worry, this evening's workshop is designed for a broad audience, and we're going to focus on things like how to tell a good story by building tension and suspense. TJ's critically acclaimed debut novel, The Reign of the Kingfisher, was published in 2019 by Flatiron Books. It is a fantastic read. I highly recommend it. and he has taught writing and literature courses at the college level for the last half decade. TJ, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so excited about what you have in store, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, and thank you, Alicia and Jordan. And just a broad thank you to the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies here. Even I'm broadcasting live from the center, from a recreation of Bradbury's office with all sorts of amazing ephemera. I wish I could show it all to you. Unfortunately, I don't have the time. So I urge you, once life has returned to normal or whatever comes after this, whatever normal means, once that day has come, that you come visit this place. It's really special. And as you heard from Jason, their mission is incredible. So I encourage you to support the center. They're doing really great work. So when Jason asked me to give a workshop through the center, I was trying to think of something that I could do that would fit a time constraint, that would speak to people who are just curious about writing, people who have begun writing or early in their career, and people who are advanced in their writing, as well as people working within different genres, and something that would also fit into the ethos of Ray Bradbury. And for those of you who are familiar with Bradbury, you know that he was a writer very well known for writing masterfully across genres. But also something that's intrinsic to Bradbury's work is suspense. He is a master of suspense, and he uses it to great effect. For anyone who's read Bradbury, you know that those books are page turners. That is because he's so good with suspense. And so today's workshop, I'd like to talk about writing suspense. And I acknowledge that when we hear suspense, we might think of the thriller genre and think that suspense is somehow unique to that, or that it cannot exist beyond that. Something I'd like to talk about today as we go through this is how suspense applies across genres, and how it benefits writing in general. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through PowerPoint. I can't shake my teacher tendencies. I have to have PowerPoints, but it will not be everlasting. Boy, it is always terrifying to share a screen, isn't it? All right. Writing suspense. And I also want to thank you guys for being here today, taking time out of your day to come talk about writing. That's awesome. Okay, so the agenda for my talk, covering some questions like what is suspense? How does suspense apply across genres? Some tips for writing it. We'll have a brief activity, and that will be followed by Q&A. So I hope you stick around. As you can see from this agenda, we're going to be working from the theoretical to the practical to give us a framework for thinking about these things before we get to doing them. So to frame our conversation here, in thinking about what good is suspense to other genres, what does suspense have to offer me, a romance writer, or I do literary fiction, or I do comic books, or I'm a memoirist? Well, suspense is going to focus your reader's empathy. That is such a crucial part of anything you're writing. You need your reader to feel empathy for your characters, your main character especially. Points 2 and 3 are related. Suspense sharpens pacing and it adds structure. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the diagramming the plot of a story. You know, we have our exposition, a rising action, climax, falling action. This space here, the rising action, that constitutes so much of a story. Suspense, that's its sweet spot, right? So it's going to help us kind of keep things rising, so to speak. And suspense also keeps the reader emotionally engaged. And I want to differentiate this point from the first point. I'm not just talking about empathy here. I'm talking about excitement, that feeling of being on the edge of your seat, the quality of a page turner. That's the kind of emotion that we're talking about. And it also might be, they might feel terrified, or just in some way emotionally impacted. suspense is going to give you the tools to do that. So any examination of suspense would not be complete without starting with sort of the de facto master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, the filmmaker, famous for the movie Psycho and Birds. So he makes a really interesting distinction that is going to help us as we work to define suspense. He says he acknowledges that when we hear suspense, we might think of mystery, but he says a mystery, in generic terms, is an intellectual process, whereas suspense is an emotional process. And to illustrate that point, he gives the example of if you have a scene and there are people sitting around a table having dinner in a restaurant, and beneath the table there is a bomb that is ticking away. In a mystery, the first thing that happens is that bomb goes off. And then the rest of that film, the rest of that book, is people trying to come together to figure out what happened and who did it, using their inductive and deductive reasoning. Whereas with suspense, what happens is the camera will show the bomb beneath the table, or the writer will acknowledge that there's a bomb beneath the table. And then we see the characters sitting around not knowing about that bomb, going about their conversation. And the plot then is the knowing that it's there, knowing that something will happen. And the characters do not know. So we know something they don't know. That creates this anticipation of the event. And that sort of metaphorical bomb going off, for our purposes, we're going to call that the crisis event. And so in suspense, you're building to a crisis event, whereas a mystery begins with one. And so Hitchcock follows by saying there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. We can substitute terror there for the word suspense, right? There's no suspense in the action alone, but in the anticipation of the action. And so on that note, let's make a distinction between action and suspense. I think that a lot of writers, especially, if you're working with an editor and they give you a note of, we need some more suspense. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I was guilty of this in my first novel. My editor said, we need more suspense. And I thought that meant just throw in some action, throw in conflict, throw in fighting, whatever. But action and suspense are not equal. But they do have a very close symbiotic relationship. They feed each other, right? So suspense is going to build the anticipation and give a certain emotion to the forthcoming action, right? By getting a reader invested, the action itself will take on those qualities of anticipation. But also, by the same token, action provides a cathartic release of that suspense, right? If suspense is building anticipation, the reader is, on the edge of their seat. There's been all of these complications that have come about. The action is going to resolve that, right? In one way or the other. So you can think of it like a horror film, right? Where you see our heroine, she goes into the basement, and she should not go into the basement. The killer is down there. So that's suspense. We know something she doesn't know. There's anticipation of a crisis event, and the crisis event might be their conflict, right? Some sort of direct engagement, which relieves that anticipation, right? So we want to distinguish between action and suspense. They're not equal, but they require each other to an extent. So some prerequisites for suspense, like the recipe for suspense. What do you need on deck? Think of this like your HelloFresh for suspense, right? Here's the ingredients we're working with. We got empathy. We're going to need foreshadowing of the crisis event, stakes, and complications. And we're going to go through all of these individually. So empathy, foreshadowing, stakes, and complications. Empathy, of course, Jason even mentioned it, that literature breeds empathy. It's certainly true. But empathy is so necessary for suspense because if we don't care about the character, we don't cheer for them. And if we don't cheer for them, we don't care what happens. So that anticipation you're building is useless if we don't care about what happens to the character. So some ways to think about how do I make an empathetic character? How do I imbue my character with those qualities? Think about what do they want? What is their desire? That is it's such a basic human instinct. It's a way of human connection. We all desire, we all want, we all know what it feels like to want something and to feel like it's unattainable in some way. Um, Also, it can be kind of a negative want. For instance, if you're writing a book and the villain has put a bomb beneath Yankee Stadium, right? To keep with our Hitchcock metaphor, if they put a bomb beneath Yankee Stadium and our protagonist is an ex NYPD officer or something, and he does not want that bomb to go off, right? That is a desire, that not wanting something to happen. And also think about what stands in their way. What are the obstacles to their goal, right? These are pretty basic creative writing tips, but when we think about them in the language of empathy, right, that we all know what it feels like to have those obstacles, right? And we're curious to see how other people deal with them. And we want to cheer someone on as they overcome obstacles. And then finally, I want to make a point. What makes them relatable? And I'm choosing the word relatable very, very purposefully. It's not the same as likable, right? We don't always need a likable main character. In fact, there's many examples of characters who are maybe not likable. Like I've pulled an example here of Walter White from Breaking Bad, or many anti-heroes, especially in television, like Tony Soprano. Um, these are characters who are, ethically not great in some way or the other. Walter White's manufacturing methamphetamine. However, we feel empathy for these characters because of certain details that the writers include. For instance, Walter White is suffering from a medical condition, right? We feel empathy for that. Everyone knows someone who's been sick, or we've been sick ourselves. He's at least at the beginning of the show, he's doing all this for his family to provide for his son and as of then unborn daughter. He's a high school teacher. There's these things that make him not only relatable, but we feel emotionally for him. So even though he's doing something that we wouldn't ordinarily endorse, most likely, we're cheering him on nonetheless because there's something that people can recognize. So we need empathy. We need the reader to care. And similarly, foreshadowing, right? So our reader cares about our character, and now we have to make them care about what is about to happen. So when we talk about foreshadow, that's probably a term that you're familiar with. I want to kind of reframe it a little bit though. So typically foreshadowing is defined as letting a reader know that something's going to happen in the future. Let's put it in the terms of a promise. Foreshadowing is a promise to your reader. It's similar to when I teach college writing. I tell my students, your thesis statement is a promise to your reader. Right? The thesis statement is going to let your reader know what is this argument? What are we going to be talking about? And then by the end of your paper, your reader should feel like, yep, they made good on that promise. And they also did it in a really interesting, nuanced, fascinating way. It's the same for foreshadowing, where if you include foreshadow, you need to make good on that promise. And you need to do it in an interesting way because you're making a pact with your reader saying, I know something you don't know, and it's going to be good. Right? So dropping those little hints. And when you drop those hints, it's going to kind of focus your reader's attention so that they kind of know what they're looking for and they're really engaging with the text. So an example I've pulled here is from our very own Bradbury, from his short story, A Sound of Thunder, which I'm sure many of you have read. I feel like I read that like 10 times in high school. But it's this really great short story where in the future, we've developed time travel capabilities, and inevitably, unsurprisingly, one of the things that we do with that technology is industrialize it. And there's this company that is hosting these hunting expeditions back in time. In this case, they're hunting a Tyrannosaurus Rex. But as our protagonist is traveling back in time, his guide warns him to stay on the pre-designated path back in time, because if he steps off it, he could alter the course of history with the smallest of actions. And so he has this quote here from the guide to our protagonist: "Step on a mouse and you leave your print like a Grand Canyon across eternity. Queen Elizabeth might never be born. Washington might not cross the Delaware. There might never be a United States at all. So be careful, stay on the path, never step off." Right? So even in this story that's about this impending conflict of man and dinosaur, this is dropped, clearly indicating that something's going to happen with that path. And most likely someone's going to step off that path. What does that mean? We're not totally sure yet, but something's going to happen. So it's a promise to the reader. However, there's ways of breaking that promise that you want to avoid. For instance, if Bradbury had dropped this line, these sentences, and then the story is this guy who shoots a dinosaur and goes back in time and everything's happy-go-lucky, that's insulting, right? That's insulting to a reader who has really invested themselves in that detail, trying to kind of figure out where this is headed. On the other hand, if it's a really predictable resolution, right? We all, I'm sure, have so many examples of movies we've seen, of books we've read, of shows that have predictable resolutions. You know, your reader wants to guess what's happening, but they don't want to be right. Right? No one wants to be right. We want to be surprised. On the extreme of that, however, if it's an unforeseeable resolution, that's not fun either. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you introduce a character at the end who comes in and solves a conflict, and maybe we've never seen them before, that's not fun, right? Because you want to make the resolution built into the story itself, right? So your reader should theoretically be able to guess what's going to happen, but hopefully they won't. Hopefully they'll be surprised. And two, when we talk about foreshadowing, it doesn't always have to be, you know, I'm using the word crisis, but we don't have to be foreshadowing a crisis of epic proportion. For instance, you know, in a very literary novel, perhaps you have your main character wake up, they look in the mirror and they see a gray hair on their head, right? Perhaps that's foreshadowing this impending existential angst that they're about to experience, grappling with their mortality, and to some extent. That's going to let the reader know, just like gray hair, it's going to let the reader know where this is headed, what should I be paying attention to. And stakes, a term, again, you might be familiar with. Essentially what we talk about when we talk about stakes are they increase the anticipation of the crisis event by putting something definitive on the line. What stands to be gained or lost through this action, through the crisis event that we're slowly building to. And I have two examples here, two vastly different examples. The first is Avengers Infinity War, and we can couple Endgame in there too. What's at stake in Avengers Endgame Infinity War? The universe, right? The entire universe is at stake. It doesn't get much bigger than that in terms of stakes. It's hard to imagine much more being on the line than all of existence. And then we have Girl Interrupted, right? Girl Interrupted is about a young woman who is admitted into a psychiatric facility. And what's at stake there is just sort of her psychological well-being, right? We want to see, the reader knows that what's at stake is she going to progress? How is she going to be altered from this? Is she going to be okay? Right? Those are the stakes. So they're much more modest. However, what I want to point out is that neither of these stakes is intrinsically better than the other. They're both appealing, they're both engaging. What matters are the two qualities that there needs to be to make successful stakes. One is they need to be earned, and two, they have to be personal. So Girl Interrupted, it's clear it earns those stakes, and it's deeply, deeply, deeply personal to our character. Um, and then with Avengers Infinity War, those are enormous stakes. However, that film earns those stakes because how many films were leading up to this one? We had so many films of each superhero, some multiple movies per superhero. So we know these characters. We've spent a lot of time with these characters, and it's been building to this. It's been this steady crescendo to this moment. So it has earned the right to have such enormous stakes. Maybe that's debatable, but I certainly think so. Um, but a warning with that is, if you're writing a 70,000 page novel or a 70,000 word novel, 70,000 pages would get the job done. 70,000 words, and your stakes are the end of the universe, that might be reaching. You might want to make it a little bit more personal, find a way to be maybe a bit more modest about it, or give your character some very deep attachment, because that would be hard to execute efficiently and in such a short space. But either way, either of those stakes are good as long as they're earned and personal. A reader will follow you. And then finally, complications and escalation. So I mentioned earlier our rising action, right? It rises because it escalates. And it escalates because there's complications to the plot, complications to our character. Um, if you were watching the movie Taken, and he receives word that Liam Neeson receives word that his daughter has been taken and being held in Europe, and he books a flight. He goes to Europe. He quickly locates her. He asks for her back, and they hand her back. That's not a movie, right? That's not suspense. We need to escalate. We need to up the stakes. We need to bring in complications. And so some common ways of doing that. One is time. This is something I do in Reign of the Kingfisher. Set a clock, right? It's called the clock. So give your characters a window to act, or else something bad will happen. So maybe they have 48 hours to deliver something, right? So set a time. It's going to add a sense of urgency that your reader will pick up on, and will induce a similar sort of anxiety on their part, creating that suspense. Another complication, though, might be morality. So for instance, I've pulled a poster of Batman here. Notice the tagline there at the top. It says, "Welcome to a world without rules." In that film in particular, the Joker invades Gotham City. He is the embodiment of chaos, of anarchy. He's unpredictable, nihilistic. There's no predicting what he will do. He will do anything. Nothing's off limits. Whereas Batman ostensibly operates on a code of conduct, some kind of virtues, right? So he doesn't use guns, for instance. He tries to avoid killing people. It's kind of nebulous at times, but he tries to avoid it. So he is working from these sort of moral strictures that make for a very interesting plot, because how does someone who abides by these rules come up against someone without rules, right? So it kind of evens the playing field in an interesting way. Circumstance, right? We all are very familiar with, if 2020 taught us anything, it's that circumstances can come in and change everything. In the space of a novel, say you're writing a romance, you have your two main characters, the two love interests. They met. There were some rough patches along the way. Maybe they hated each other when they first met each other, but now they're warming up to each other. Things are looking good. Things are going well. But then an ex comes into town, and one of the characters gets dinner with their ex. Feelings might be rekindled, right? So that circumstance, that happenstance, is going to add complications. Another common tactic is to increasingly isolate your main character. A good example of this recently was Queen's Gambit on Netflix, which I'm sure some of you saw, about a young chess prodigy with substance abuse problems. And as the series progresses, those problems kind of come to light when she's pushing some of her closest allies away, or those allies are maybe distancing themselves. And it seems like all hope is lost, right? She's approaching her big climax, big crisis event of this big chess tournament, and she's without her closest allies to help her practice, to help her prepare. So that isolation creates a tension of how is she going to pull this off. And then, of course, if applicable, an antagonist. And I say if applicable because there's examples of novels and short stories that aren't with a definitive antagonist, right? And I'm sure we all learned, man versus self in school, and so you may not have an antagonist. However, if you do, make sure that they're a good foil, right? So I brought up the example of Joker and Batman, but it's such a good example of the Joker is everything Batman's not, and that him being that foil, him having those qualities, makes him extremely powerful, even if he shouldn't be, right? If Batman has no rules and the Joker has no rules, Batman wins, right? So Batman needs those rules to kind of handicap him, so to speak. But either way, complications and escalations should serve the role of, you foreshadow your crisis event. So it's already a big, we know we're headed towards this thing and it seems like a big problem. Complications and escalation, that's going to make an already big problem seem like an impossible problem. And it will make a reader invest themselves thinking, how could they possibly come out on top? So getting more into the nitty gritty of this, some tips for writing suspense. The first one, there's ski jumps and cliffhangers. So you're familiar with a cliffhanger. If you watch like 24 or Lost, they deal in cliffhangers. To me, I prefer the term ski jumps, and I'll explain why. Cliffhangers often seem a little bit insulting in the sense that when I hear cliffhanger, I think of an action that stops midway, right? Like if you're watching a television show, character raises a gun to the protagonist, screen goes black, to be continued, right? To me, that's a cliffhanger. That feels like a very obvious ploy to get the viewer to come back, right? It's very on its face, seems kind of desperate is what I want to say. So what I prefer is something my editor introduced me to, this idea of the ski jump. So say you're writing a novel, right? The job of the writer, something you really want to happen, is for your reader to reach the end of your chapter and to keep going, right? You don't want them to just dog ear the next chapter and say, I'll get to that tomorrow night. You want them to read through the night. You don't want them to put it down. So no matter what genre you're writing in, you want your reader to be so invested. And so a way of doing that is at the end of your chapter to include what I call ski jumps, or my editor called ski jumps, which is end the chapter with a complication or an escalation. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be this enormous thing that just happened. It can be modest. But what that does is, if you're ending on a complication or an escalation, it's going to let your reader know, oh, there's still movement to this. Like this isn't over. Like this is still getting more complicated. Or perhaps, oh, they're going to that place next. Oh, well, I need to see that. Or they're going to meet that person in the next chapter. Cool, I want to see that. Right. So it's giving an indication that there's still momentum here. Another tip is multiple points of perspective, points of view. Sorry. So an example of how this operates outside of the thriller genre. In my dissertation, I'm writing on The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, which won the Pulitzer a couple years ago. A phenomenal novel, very much an example of what we would consider literary fiction. And what that does is it's about this escaped slave named Cora, who takes this literal underground railroad to escape the horrors of her life. And meanwhile, we see her, we occupy her headspace, and then the novel will shift to a slave catcher who's after Cora. And what that does is it creates this really, really great suspense where, even in the context of literary fiction, we have this suspense where we can see their paths converging. We know that they're going to collide. and we can see the villain setting traps, and we see her unwittingly falling into it, right? So we feel on the edge of our seats, wanting to see how she comes out of this, right? So multiple points of view can be really, really effective in creating that suspense. The next is a writing tip in general, but I feel like um, in suspenseful moments, writers like to reach for adverbs. Writers like to reach for adverbs in general, I think, but especially in those moments that are supposed to be suspenseful, and go easy on them. So for instance, if you have characters hiding, they don't have to be hiding quietly, right? They can just be hiding. They don't have to be running quickly. They can just run. Um, Adverbs, and the reason for that is adverbs tend to make for gangly, kind of awkward prose, kind of gunks it up. Um, when you're in a suspenseful moment, you want to just glide through the sentences without having these kind of stumbly words like adverbs. Not to say that there's no place for them, there is, but just go easy. And the final point I want to make is on outlining before we get to our activity. And you know, outlining is such a, I feel like, controversial one. The reason why I wanted to talk about to outline or not to outline is because I recognize that in talking about things like, you need an empathetic character, you need complications, you need foreshadow, you need this great crisis event. It seems like, well, how is that supposed to come about organically? Like, how do I just start writing and that happens? So there's a case to be made for some outlining. What I would say, my suggestion, this is my personal tip, is to have a sense of what you want your crisis event to be. What is going to be this thing that this work is building to? If you're writing a novel, what is going to be the climax? If you're writing a short story, what is this building to? And define that, know your character, know what makes them empathetic, and then write it, right? Just write it. It's going to be bad. All first drafts are bad, but write that draft. And then, once you put the pen on page, once you've worked all the way to that climax, go back and you can start adding foreshadow, right? It's so much easier to add foreshadowing after the fact, because if you add it first, what you run the risk of is, I include this foreshadow. Now I feel like I have to resolve this, right? Like I'm bound to fulfill this promise, or I added this foreshadow. It's going to be really, really difficult, or it's just going to throw off the entire plot. So it's so much easier to add that after you know where this is headed. It might save you a ton of time. And also, another reason why I think it's good to have maybe a skeleton, but you write the thing first before you get specific, is that you want to leave room to surprise yourself. I know that in my own writing, my own book, so much of my favorite moments of suspense came from, just writing it, kind of having a direction in mind, but writing it and realizing, oh, this character could do this later, or this character should have done that earlier, and then going back and changing it. And if you're surprising yourself, the chances are very, very high that you will surprise a reader. And that is so important, right? So give yourself some room to find something, to discover something. Okay, now I want to do an activity. This will be a brief activity, but just to kind of materialize some of the things that we're talking about today. So here's the opening sentences from A Sound of Thunder, which we talked about earlier, the Ray Bradbury story. So this is the opening lines. It says, "The sign on the wall seemed to quaver," let me move, "under his eyelids," or under a film of sliding warm water. Sorry. Eccles felt his eyelids blink over his stare, and the sign burned in this momentary darkness. Time Safari Incorporated, safaris to any year in the past. You name the animal, we take you there, you shoot it. All right, so these are the opening sentences. So let's pause and notice a few things here. Notice how the sentence hooks a reader with an immediate foreshadowing of a pretty significant crisis event, right? We know that they're going back in time to kill an animal. That's very engaging, right? What kind of animal? Why? How's that going to play out? These are questions that come to mind immediately. But it's also, in that foreshadow, it's delivering important exposition. Namely, it's introducing our protagonist while also introducing a relatable quality, right? That we can attach ourselves to early. In this case, Eccles is terrified. He seemed to quaver under a film of sliding warm water. So sort of evoking this feverish terror. He felt his eyelids blink over his stare, right? So he's with rapt attention, just staring at the sign, probably thinking, what am I doing? So we have a sense of what Eccles is like. We can relate to that fear. I think we would all share that fear. And we're hooked on a foreshadow, right? All early in the story. It's masterful. So for our activity, what I want to challenge you to do, and I recognize that it is challenging, is to write an introductory sentence or two for a novel, a memoir even, short story, hybrid genre, whatever. Write an introductory sentence that foreshadows your crisis event while also introducing a relatable aspect of your protagonist. Again, not maybe likable, but a relatable aspect. So taking on the Bradbury challenge, so to speak. And I'll give you, 5 minutes or something to just imagine something quickly. And then share it in the chat box so we can look at each other's work. This is a judgment-free zone. I'm sure many of you are strangers. You have nothing to lose. All right. So take some time to do that. I might work on something too. So we'll come back together in a few minutes here, and we'll see what we got. Oh, wow, there's some good ones. Ratshaven had about 1/100th of a second to react before the flames fried him to an ashy mound. It's amazing how many thoughts could appear, process, and depart within that extremely short time span. That's good. I spend time to sec work in, but I just want to sleep. Good. Oh man. Took Moira a few moments to realize that the tiny figure in the dollhouse was not a doll, but a dead body. Okay, I'll read the rest of that. Wow. Wow, you guys killed it. It's amazing. Sunday was Judgment Day, the only day of the week that I would even consider wearing a dress. I hated dress. I wondered if others would recognize this and consider me a fraud. Maybe they could see through this mask I wore. Well done, Ashley. Wow. Really good, guys. Really, really impressive. You see, you all are suspense writers. Look at that. And I can tell all the different genres we're working with. Awesome, amazing. I'm so proud of you all. And thank you for bearing with me, and you did great with that. I hope you all write those stories. If you haven't already written the stories, write those stories. What are you waiting for? Do it. All right, I'll turn it over to Alicia now.
Absolutely. As Bradbury would say, just sit down and write. It doesn't matter if it's terrible. Chances are it will not be.
That's right.
So we do not have any questions yet. So if people have any questions, if there's something specific you want to ask TJ, if there's some feedback you're looking for, go ahead and use the Q&A feature. First off, I wanted to start, you finished your PhD, you've published Reign of the Kingfisher. I posted a link in the chat to his website earlier. I will post another one. So tell us, what's next?
Good question. So I have to finish my dissertation, or I have to finish my PhD. So I'm defending my dissertation at the end of this month. And then hopefully gonna find myself a job teaching literature or writing somewhere. And then keep writing. You know, I have a few irons in the fire. I'm working on a few projects that I'm really, really excited about, and I can't wait to share with everyone when the day comes. But yeah, that's my life right now, trying to figure it out, put it in order, and keep writing.
Awesome. All right, well, we got some questions rolling in. Julie would like to know, how does this apply to poetry, or does it?
Man, that is such a good question. And I've been thinking about it a lot because, you know, I wanted to make it clear how this works across genres and forms. Like, you know, I mentioned memoirs, short story, etc., even flash fiction to an extent, or definitely. To poetry, though, will see the difficulty here is that I am so out of my depths when it comes to poetry. Despite the English PhD, my focus is exclusively fiction. Poetry is the most intimidating thing in the world to me. But I think that there is from my limited knowledge of poetry, I think there is something to be said for introducing a concept that your reader of the poem wants to know more about, right? From my understanding of poetry, you're fleshing out an idea over the course of this poem, and so, you know, you can kind of allude to the fact that this is going to get complicated. This is going to surprise you, the direction that we're headed.
I'm not an English major, art history and museum studies, so it sounded good to me.
Okay.
Next question, in suspense, where you want to keep your promises to your reader, how do you handle red herrings?
Oh, good. Okay, so red herrings, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is we can think of those from like the mystery genres where they're very, very prevalent, which is when the writer kind of throws out a detail to throw you off the scent. Literally, red herring comes from when they would train dogs for hunting rabbit, I think. They would use pickled fish, red herring. The pickling process would turn the fish red, and use it to scatter it about to train the dog to stay on the scent of the actual rabbit. So if you're into nerdy stuff like that, that's where that comes from. But how do we deal with red herrings? Great question. Red herrings are great. Red herrings can be super, super effective, especially if you're writing a mystery. I'm big on red herrings. The problem is going to be, you know, because red herrings shouldn't be foreshadowing. So here, for instance, I think of the show Lost, which I hope some of you are familiar with.
Love Lost.
It's so good. Well, it's kind of good because there's this very famous episode where the episode ends with these polar bears sweeping through the island, and it is it's fascinating. It's very suspenseful when you're watching it because you're like, what's going to happen here? Like, what is this indicating? What is this foreshadowing? But it doesn't really ever touch. It does kind of touch on it later, but it's so unsatisfactory. It seems very half-hearted. It very much comes across like the writers knew this would be suspenseful, and just sort of put it in. It was like, we'll get to it later. Like, we'll figure it out. That's the problem, right? So red herrings are fine as long as they're intentional and they're serving their purpose. However, if you include a detail that is in no way fulfilled or that is not furthering the plot, that is just a misused red herring, right? That is just kind of weighing it down.
I read a fascinating article that I think did it air on ABC. The director went to Hawaii and was sitting on the beach and said, "What if a plane crashed?" And so the writers were literally writing episode to episode the entire first season. So they
That
threw in
makes
a
sense.
bunch of red herrings. And then at the end of the first season, they were like, "All right, we got to figure out where we're going with this."
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. All right. Ashley would like to know, can there be multiple points of crisis?
Oh yeah. So I'm going to answer this question like Aristotle. All climaxes are crisis events. Not all crisis events are climaxes. So what I mean by that is, yeah, like I brought up the example of like horror. There's going to be one climax in horror where there's finally either the monster or the person must emerge, right? However, leading up to that, there's a ton of crises, right? Like I said, they walk into the basement and then they turn on the light. There he is, run away, right? There's a crisis for you. So it can be, crisis events can be relatively small or scattered, but they're building to the ultimate one, which is the climax. So you can have many leading up to the big, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Seth would like to know, what is the easiest way to get published?
Oh man, Seth, man, I wish I knew, dude. I That's a tough question. I think it depends on what you want to publish. First of all, I mean, if you want to do short stories, which is I recommend for any writer who wants to do fiction, start with your short stories, send them out to literary journals. There's a ton. They're all awesome and fascinating, and that's a good way to kind of familiarize yourself with the publishing process. But if you're talking about like a novel, um, you know, just write the thing, and then at that point it becomes a question of, do you want to self-publish or do you want to go traditional? Either way, it's not going to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would do it. So just stick with it. And yeah, I don't know, it's always going to be hard, but that's what kind of makes it fun.
Yeah, don't give up.
Yeah.
Jennifer would like to know, do you find it's better to write in first or third person? And would you say that it depends on the genre?
Ooh, that's a fun question. Up until probably 2 years ago, I would have, in private, very much like thumbed my nose at the first person. I just found it, I never could engage with like a first person narrator. So I always preferred third person. However, I've really been getting into first person. I think it's a lot of fun to play with. Um, uh, so I think we see a lot of first person in thrillers. I feel like, I mean, like your James Pattersons and your John Grishams will often do the third person, but especially some of like the more literary thrillers will go first person, which I think is interesting. I'm not totally sure what to make of that. But the first person can be really fun in a thriller because you're inhabiting their world, their terror, their issues so much more intimately. Whereas a benefit of the third person is, again, creating that dramatic irony of letting the reader know something that the character doesn't know, which I don't think there's a way of doing that in first person. So it kind of depends. I mean, there's going to be trade-offs either way, or there's books that combine third person and first person, and that can be a lot of fun too. So, but good question, and that's a question we're thinking about.
Absolutely. Haley would like to know, I was wondering if you might talk about how you might use suspense in short form nonfiction, college papers, for example, to keep the reader interested.
Good question.
Yeah,
Great
that's a good
question.
one, Haley.
I know. Yeah, this is we're asking phenomenal questions. So in academic writing and like a college paper, and this is coming from, someone who's read a lot of college papers. Um, and this applies to fiction as well, so stick with me here. Your suspense, you don't want to overdo it, right? You don't want to make it clear that you're reaching. And what I mean by that is, like in a college paper, for instance, what I often see are these opening lines that act as the hook, which I think is something they teach in high school, of like, imagine yourself in a room with, and doing something like that, building to a paper topic about like GMOs or something. And it's like, don't, that's kind of insulting to me. Like I'm interested in what you have to say. However, and so that applies for fiction as well. Like you don't want to be overly ham-fisted with it. But in a college paper, the elements of this still apply, of like, like I said, the thesis should be foreshadowing where you're headed. And complications. I mean, when you're introducing sources to your paper, it should be complicating your argument. It should be either enriching it, adding a new dimension to what you're saying, or otherwise flat out challenging it and saying, and trying to incorporate that into your paper, right? So that's kind of like complications, escalations. Yeah, that's a cool question though. Thank you.
I have a paper due tonight. Let's see if I can
Oof,
revise it a bit.
yikes.
All right. GP wants to know, what is the connection between teaching, getting a PhD, and writing? Why look for a job instead of writing?
Oh man, I ask myself that question every day. So the connection, I mean, on a practical level, I teach as part of the PhD, but beyond sort of the pure practical, I wanted to get a PhD because I knew that I loved writing and I love reading, and those are the only two things I'm good at. And I thought, why not, do it professionally? But also, I found it to be kind of mutually enriching. Like my creative writing plays no part in my PhD. It's not helping my PhD. It's something I do purely on the side. But I think and I'm speaking to an audience of fellow writers here, as a writer, you learn so many important skills. And for me, those have been really transferable and portable to my academic work. The first one just being just this like tough nose perseverance, right? To be a writer, you're going to deal with so much rejection. You're going to constantly feel like an imposter. You're going to feel kind of directionless. You're going to have these deep despair, but you keep doing it because that's what you do, and you know that you will do it. You will get over it. You will accomplish it. And that's been super useful for me in the PhD, because that's a long slog, but that's kind of how they connect for me. And I mean, as an English PhD, I get to read a ton of books and think about them, and that helps my writing intrinsically.
Absolutely. Yeah, speaking of rejection, Ray Bradbury, Dr. Eller's first biography, Becoming Ray Bradbury. The first few chapters are just Bradbury getting let down hard. And it was like, I'm proud of him for keeping at it and for ignoring all of the criticism and just keeping doing it, because he ended up being so successful. So
Yeah.
I think that's important to note. All right. Gillian wants to know, what recommendations do you have for writers who are just starting out?
Good question. First one is read a lot. Read. There's if you think you're doing too much reading, don't worry, you're not. It's all about just ingesting and absorbing. But for the actual writing itself, some tips. I think for me, the best tip I could offer a beginning writer is finish what you're working on, no matter how much you don't want to. The most important thing you can kind of condition yourself to early in your writing career is sticking with it, because there will be so many times throughout your writing career where you come across something and you love it at first, you love it, halfway through, you're like, I can't do it. I can't finish this. I have no idea where this is going. I hate it. I just want to start something new because starting something new is so exciting and fun. But if you never let yourself quit on something, if you see it through, no matter how much you think it's not good, it will build that sort of ability to stick with things. And there's so many things that I've written that the first time through, I'm like, this is just a throwaway. This is nothing. And it turned out to be really good through revising. So as a beginning writer, finish what you start. And two, I don't think enough people talk about this. Give yourself some leeway. There's so much advice out there of like, write every day. If you're not writing every day, what are you doing? And you should be writing these many words or whatever. Take care of yourself. I mean, writing's awesome, but do it because it's fun, and don't be one of these like weird masochists about it. They're terrible.
Absolutely. Okay, so we still have 17 questions left, but part of good Zoom program etiquette is to end on time and to let people go. So Jason and Jordan, if you want to come back, we will say our goodbyes. I think I can spotlight you guys too, or do I unspotlight?
All right, am I back?
You're back. All
TJ,
right,
that was
everybody.
TJ, that was incredible.
Fabulous.
Well done. Thank you so much. Yeah, we just appreciate the workshop and the insights that you provided. It was fantastic. Thank you.
My privilege. Thank
Didn't
you.
get your questions answered, keep an eye out. We will be doing more programs like this, so you'll have a chance to hopefully come back and ask TJ your question again.
Yeah.
If you liked this program, Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, we are a nonprofit, we are unfunded. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to our Forever 451 campaign. If you are so inclined, or if you have any rich friends that are so inclined, pass on the link. Go buy TJ's book. It's amazing. There's the link. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you so much, TJ, for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming, everyone. I appreciate it.
All right. I guess
And
we'll head
support
on
the Ray
out.
Bradbury Center. For crying out loud.
Everyone have a good evening.
Bye.
Everyone, thank you.